Hello and welcome to 7 Days of Science. In the headlines this week, 52,000-year-old woolly mammoth chromosomes have been found frozen in ice, the age of the last universal common ancestor of all life on Earth has been calculated, a new species of burrowing dinosaur has been discovered, and much more. Starting off the news this week, yet more data from NASA's Cassini spacecraft has been analysed in a new study. We looked at another study recently here on 7 Days of Science that looked to see whether or not the land around Titan's seas had waves by analysing the coastal erosion of the moon. Titan is Saturn's largest moon, and the only body in the solar system other than Earth that has standing bodies of liquid on its surface. This study also focused on Titan's hydrocarbon seas, and made several interesting conclusions. For one, the researchers say that they think the rivers that flow into Titan seas are probably pure methane, whereas the seas themselves contain a lot more of ethane. They compare this to freshwater rivers flowing into the salty seas of Earth, which also lines up with the idea that the rain that falls on Titan is pure methane as well. As we said a couple of weeks ago, there has been very little direct evidence from the data that there were large waves on Titan as Cassini flew past, with surface waves on the seas only measuring 3.3 millimeters, except in some specific areas like estuaries and coastal waters where they got up to 5.2 millimeters. This difference in wave height, however small, does suggest that there may be tidal currents present on Titan. Despite the wealth of information analysed in this study, the researchers still say there's a lot more work to do, calling this study the first step. An exciting first step nonetheless, and more information about Titan and its seas can bring forward a wealth of knowledge for us to extrapolate into the wider universe as we seek to understand how standing bodies of liquid work when they're not on Earth. In other news, a study published in the journal Nature has analysed radar images of the subsurface opening on the moon to determine whether or not it is an opening to a wider underground area. Basically, they're trying to work out whether or not it would lead to a cave on the moon. Obviously, as the moon is very far away, this isn't done particularly easily, but the conclusions that the researchers came to have been fascinating. For the first time ever, they have found solid evidence of an actual cave on the satellite, which could be at least 100 meters deep. The researchers say that this could well be indicative of a much larger cave system underneath the moon. This is particularly exciting because such a system could end up being a good place to set up a permanent base for humans. Being underneath the surface comes with a whole host of advantages, as you get to avoid the dangerous effects that come with being so exposed on the moon's surface, with no atmosphere to protect you. Of course, it also comes with a couple of snags. The cave is so deep that you would need some kind of lift system to bring astronauts up from the base and down to it, and quite a large one at that. A brilliant study that is another important piece of information for those who look to bring humanity back to the moon in a much more permanent way by the end of the decade and beyond. In the recent environmental news, we have the sad report that 77 long-finned pilot whales recently became stranded on a beach on the island of Orkney in Scotland. It is thought that the whales had been stranded for some time, with only 12 live animals being found amongst the dead ones. Unfortunately, the 12 that had survived had to be euthanized after attempts to rescue them failed. Pilot whales are well known to have mass strandings. They have a matriarchal society and strong social bonds, so when one member of a pod gets into difficulties, such as being ill or disorientated, others often follow them to give them support. These pilot whales were stranded close together, which is a behavioural stress response. It usually means that something, such as a sound or predator, could have frightened them out of the water, which made them cluster. So far, post-mortems have been carried out on 30 of the whales, and preliminary findings show that they were healthy. Their stomach contents indicate that they had been feeding not long before they were stranded. Ear samples have been taken from some whales to examine for acoustic trauma, but there are no results yet. Investigators are also trying to establish whether any orcas were in the area. Meanwhile, the Orkney Island Council are faced with the huge task of removing the bodies from the beach. Also in the news this week, a very exciting study has investigated the nature of the last universal common ancestor, or LUCA. LUCA is the point on the tree of life that all living things on the planet can trace their ancestry back to, from animals and plants to the smallest bacteria. We know that all life on Earth descends from LUCA because of the universal genetic code all life has, plus other fundamental shared aspects such as using ATP as a common energy currency. However, figuring out what exactly LUCA was and when it lived has been a complicated and contentious problem for researchers. This new study has looked at the genes in various modern genomes and counted the mutations that have accumulated over time since common ancestry with LUCA, and calibrated this with the microbial fossil record, as well as isotope records. They came to the astounding conclusion that LUCA lived about 4.2 billion years ago, much earlier than we had expected, and only 400 million years after the Earth and the solar system formed, only. They were also able to tell that LUCA was a relatively complex organism and was comparable to modern prokaryotic organisms such as bacteria. Very interestingly, LUCA already had an early immune system too, suggesting that it was already in an evolutionary arms race with viruses. LUCA was also part of a somewhat productive very early ecological community, as its waste would have provided food for other microbes, creating a recycling ecosystem. It's an incredibly significant and fascinating new paper showing how fast life on Earth was to establish an ecosystem in those early days. Another mind-blowing paper on ancient genetics was also published this last week, as the chromosomes of a woolly mammoth that lived 52,000 years ago have been preserved as subfossils after the mammoth tissue rapidly freeze-dried in the cold. The researchers took a skin sample from the head of a female woolly mammoth that was uncovered in the Siberian permafrost and applied a newly developed variant of a technique to analyse the 3D shape and structure of chromosomes. Amazingly, they discovered that the nanometer scale structure of the chromosomes was still intact even after all this time, and architectural features such as chromosome territories and even the tiny chromatin loops involved in bringing transcription factors to the genes they control. This level of detail has never been seen before in preserved ancient DNA samples, with one of the authors stating that this is a new type of fossil and its scale dwarfs that of individual ancient DNA fragments 1,000,000 times more sequence. These findings also enabled the researchers to reveal that mammoths had 28 chromosomes, the same number as modern elephants. Not only that, but by looking at the compartmentalization of the genes, they were also able to find which genes were switched on or off, so essentially studying mammoth epigenetics. Comparing the patterns of gene activation to the closest living relative of the woolly mammoth, the Asian elephant, they revealed that 4% of the genes differed. These differences were mostly found in the genes that control hair follicle development, which makes sense considering the difference in hairiness between the species. The study also explores how exactly this astonishing level of detail was preserved for over 50,000 years. It seems most likely that the rapid freeze-drying of the tissue just after the mammoth died caused the chromosomes to undergo a glass transition, essentially a process that means cooled and dehydrated material won't lose the molecules by diffusion, therefore preserving all the tiny details. The researchers also experimentally tested this hypothesis by freeze-drying some beef, waiting a year and subjecting it to numerous trials, including running it over in a car, throwing a baseball at it, and shooting it with a shotgun. Why not, I guess? Okay. They even documented these experiments and made a music video out of them. You've got to love scientists.
The mammoth 52k old, frozen in the permafrost, the story to be told. DNA destruction derby with beef jerky.
Oh my god.
We pitched a baseball, threw in liquid nitrogen, tested its strength, its experiments in lightning.
Emotional damage. That was incredible. I'm gonna add that to my Spotify playlist. Anyway, the chromosome architecture was indeed preserved in the beef after all this, supporting the hypothesis for the rapid freeze-drying explaining the exceptional preservation. So another extraordinary prehistoric discovery, and way of displaying it. I mean, I don't quite know how to go on after I've experienced that. Nothing will beat it. There's more news about frozen prehistoric animals next, as a mummified woolly rhinoceros carcass has been described after it was found in Siberia. This was a young individual between 4 and 4.5 years old at the time of death, and it lived more than 32,000 years ago during the late Pleistocene epoch. The rhino, known as the Abyisky rhinoceros, was unearthed back in the August of 2020, and this description has identified some interesting features such as the presence of a fatty hump above the shoulder region, which had not been documented in the woolly rhino before. The right side of the mummy is better preserved than the left side, which seems to have been torn into by scavengers, and it's noted that most of the intestines are missing. The preserved fur is consistent with previous finds of woolly rhinos, which indicate that juveniles had lighter coloured hair than adults. Interestingly, the fur was also found to contain the remains of various arthropods, including certain water fleas that are no longer present in the region. So lots of interesting things have been found out thanks to this spectacular specimen. Well, the paleontology news this week has been absolutely action-packed, with not one but 3 new species of dinosaurs named over the past few days. The first of these new species is a new kind of herbivorous iguanodontian dinosaur, named based on fossils discovered on the Isle of Wight here in the UK and just across the sea from us. It's called Comptonatus chasei, and it's known from relatively complete fossils revealing lots of interesting things about iguanodontian evolution. However, I won't say too much about this new species here, as Ben will actually be interviewing the paleontologists who described this animal in an upcoming episode of 7 Days of Science. So watch out for that and much more on this amazing dinosaur. The second new dinosaur species named this week was discovered in Utah, in rocks laid down during the late Cretaceous period about 99.5 million years ago. It's been named Fona herzogae, and it's actually a burrowing dinosaur. The fossils of this dinosaur were uncovered over many years of fieldwork at a few localities in Utah, and it's known from multiple individuals that altogether give us a very complete record of this animal's skeleton. It's a kind of small-bodied, primarily herbivorous dinosaur known as Thescelosaur. Did I actually say that right?
Yeah.
This group includes other small species that have previously been proposed to be burrowers, such as Erictodromaeus, also from North America. Fona was found to show lots of anatomical similarities with Erictodromaeus that indicate an ability to dig, such as the robust humerus, expanded muscle attachment points, reinforced attachments between the pelvis and vertebrae for stability, as well as other features. This little dinosaur would also have coexisted with the small-bodied tyrannosaur Moros intrepidus, as well as the huge predatory Seats micororum. So burrowing could have been a good way to stay safe from such threats. It's a wonderful addition to the fossil record of these little dinosaurs. The third new dinosaur of the week was unearthed in Mongolia from rocks dating to the late Cretaceous about 71 million years ago. It's been named Harenadraco prima, and is a new kind of troodontid theropod. Its genus name comes from the Latin for sand dragon, and the species name prima refers to it being the first troodontid to be described from this particular geological formation. This is quite significant as Harenadraco was found in the Baranguyot Formation, which was part of the greater Nemegt basin of the Gobi Desert. Many famous dinosaur discoveries have been made in the Nemegt basin, such as Therizinosaurus, Velociraptor and Tarbosaurus, and it's particularly rich in troodontids too, with 8 different ones being named before now. However, all of these troodontids have come from the formations below and above the Baranguyot Formation. So it seems strange that there were lots of these dinosaurs living before and after this formation was laid down, and yet no troodontids have been discovered in these rocks themselves. Well, now one has. Harenadraco is known from a partial skeleton including bits of the hip, a portion of the right femur, and bits of the left hind limb, including a decent amount of the foot. Harenadraco was quite small and was a lightly built animal that could likely run very fast, being suited for chasing down small prey such as mammals and evading the raptors that may have hunted it. Another amazing dinosaur discovery. Also in the paleo news this week, a new species of pseudosuchian reptile from the Triassic period has been described in Nevada, and it has quite the name. It's called Benggwigwishingasuchus eremicarminis.
You nearly got it. It's Suchus nosaurus.
It's called Benggwigwishingasuchus eremicarminis.
That was good, yeah.
Which they may have chosen deliberately so they could laugh at me trying to pronounce it. Also Beng. The name comes from the Shoshone term Benggwigwishinga, which means catching fish, plus erema and carminis, meaning desert song, which the paper explains honours Elaine Kramer and Monica Schaefer and their love of the paleontology, museums, and opera of the southwestern USA. That name's really put me through the ringer. So the full name is intended to translate as Fisherman Croc's Desert Song. Anyway, it's known from a rather lovely fossil preserving most of the body and a few fragmentary bones from its skull. It lived during the mid-Triassic, about 242 million years ago, and was found to be a poposaurid, a large grouping of croc relatives that includes some amazing, very superficially dinosaur-like species. Interestingly, Benggwigwishingasuchus seem to have been adapted to life on the coast, being discovered in a marine paleo environment and showing some adaptations for a nearshore lifestyle, suggesting that although it was still primarily a terrestrial animal, it may have ventured into the sea to feed. Another very interesting new species then, showing how these pseudosuchian croc relatives were experimenting with coastal life at this time, and just guessing how far we can push the that word English, no English anymore. And finally for the news this week, a study has analysed the patterns of gene flow resulting from interbreeding between Neanderthals and modern humans, using a new method to better model the complex back and forth exchanges between our species. This research sought to specifically work out the effects of this gene flow on Neanderthals, developing a technique to estimate how much of the Neanderthal genome came from interbreeding with the ancestors of modern humans. They reveal that Neanderthal population sizes were actually about 20% smaller than had been previously realised, and found two distinct pulses of gene flow from modern humans into Neanderthals. The first of these pulses occurred about 250 to 200,000 years ago, consistent with the timing of an early dispersal of modern humans out of Africa and into Eurasia, where they would have encountered Neanderthals. The second pulse was timed between 120 and 100,000 years ago, again consistent with the presence of the Nile-Sinai land bridge, and fossils plus archaeological evidence showing modern humans reached the Levant and Arabian Peninsula around this time. These early human expansions out of Africa occurred long before the dispersals that modern living non-African populations can trace much of their ancestry back to, which took place about 50 to 60,000 years ago. So these fascinating results therefore show how these older, essentially extinct dispersals of modern humans nevertheless had a significant effect on human evolutionary history, with their genes contributing to the Neanderthal genome. Their findings also have implications for Neanderthal extinction, with results indicating gradually decreasing Neanderthal numbers over time that ultimately became assimilated into the human gene pool, after their own population became too small to absorb modern humans. So lots of incredibly interesting discoveries from this research. Well, that's it for the news this week. I hope you enjoyed learning about everything that's happened in these last 7 days of science. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at BenGThomas if you'd like, for more short form videos about science news and extinct animals. You can also follow me on Instagram at Miss Amelia Evans. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.